Thanks for choosing to listen to this Late Night Linux Family podcast. We're only able to do this because of the people who support us. None of our shows are paywalled, but our Patreon supporters can get most episodes early and never hear any ads. Learn more at latenightlinux.com/support or support us by telling a friend or colleague about everything we do. 2.5 Admins, episode 306. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is using object storage with OpenZFS and SeaweedFS.
So in this tutorial, we walked through how to set up SeaweedFS and start offering, S3 compatible object storage on top of ZFS and get the best of both worlds and allow you to use one storage system for all your different storage needs.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. I saw an interesting thread recently on Mastodon from Jeff Moss, who is the founder of DEF CON, talking about how he would have liked to have set up private email and VPN services, but then having really looked into it, he decided it was just a terrible, terrible idea.
So to be clear, he was talking about providing a service that he would sell to people. So not just hosting his own email, but making a DEF CON-based email service and VPN service, which is a lot different than just hosting your own email. But yeah, there's, beyond all the reasons we've talked about, the difficulty of hosting your own email.
Deliverability specifically.
Yeah, take all of those problems and multiply them by having random people use it, having to support those users, having to meet all their demands, and then all the problems that come with especially trying to make something as kind of privacy and freedom focused as DEF CON's kind of on brand would be.
Yeah, the surprising thing to me is that it took somebody who is deeply involved with DEF CON any time at all to come up with the ideas. Well, that was a terrible, horrible, no good idea as like a relatively low stress business model. I mean, you think about all the things that you see in your own email, over the years, how many porn pitches have you gotten? How many grifts, how many scams, how much utterly unwanted, just normal spam crap. I think we all know at this point that email is something like 99.8% spam these days. And again, that's without even getting into the just outright illegal stuff that you better know your P's and Q's about safe harbor law, where you will live and operate, which may not be the same as they are, for any one of the three of us who all live in different places with different laws about, your safe harbor for providing a service. And then VPNs just become even worse than that. I mean, once you get into VPNs, now you're adding piracy and very illegal things on top of all that, because if you want to do something illegal, what's the first thing that you want to do? Well, you want to hide it. And what's the way that you hide it? Well, you use a VPN. So yeah, there's just, it's going to be a never ending stream of fraud and criminal activity and asshattery if you're trying to provide these services to the public, as opposed to a tightly regulated group of people that you actually know and who know you and who care about what your opinion of them is. And to be clear, even if it's, say, 100 people that you know in the way that I just described, some of those people are going to wind up being a problem. Trust me.
Yeah, even if they don't mean to be themselves, maybe their machine gets compromised. I mean, it's probably less likely with DEF CON people, but you can't rule it out. And their machine gets compromised, their laptop say, and suddenly that is then sending out spam and potentially illegal stuff.
Well, let's be honest. I mean, if we're talking about DEF CON people, I'm not trying to say anything negative about DEF CON or the people who go there, but I mean, you're literally offering a service in part to professional red teamers. You'd better believe there's going to be some shenanigans involved one way or another.
Yeah, and so Jeff was able to kind of leverage his position to approach this slightly differently in that he went and talked to people who run other services like this to ask him what the kind of the problem areas are. So we talked to people at like Proton Mail and MailFence and others, and they're like, well, we have 10 people whose full-time job it is to deal with child sexual abuse materials. I'm not including all the lawyers and the people they have to manage relationships with law enforcement. And then they have another room with, 30 people who just deal with spammers and the impact of spammers, managing their AS number, their IP net blocks, making sure that they don't get on blacklists and that they're limiting what people can send and making sure that none of their outgoing email is spam.
And then if they get onto one of those lists, they have to find a new IP range to send it from and all of that.
Yeah, it was just dealing with all of that. And like, how do we, kind of quarantine people who just signed up and make sure that they can't cause problems in the early days and he's like, okay, so email's out. We're going to look at VPN. And then it's like, oh, it's worse.
Yeah, because at least with email, you can have one server in one place. Whereas with a VPN, you necessarily need endpoints all over the world, really. And then you're in third-party jurisdictions and using other people's hardware, and it just kind of compounds all of the problems of running an email service.
And a huge number of your potential customers for VPNs want to use them for explicitly, let's not say illegal, but let's say terms of service violating purposes. I mean, most of the people that I see using VPNs these days are either using a VPN by default for everything because they've bought into a snake oil pitch that says, this will make you secure, which of course it does no such thing, or they're using it to avoid region locks, which again is violation of a terms of service. If Netflix wanted you to see their UK content from within the US, they would make it available in the US. And when they don't, and you use a VPN with an endpoint in the UK to try to get around that, well, they don't like that, and they're going to try to figure out ways to make that not happen. So all those same issues you have with laundering net blocks for email become orders of magnitude worse for VPNs if you actually care about what your customers want to use them for. And trust me, they want to use them for avoiding region locks.
I would argue that Netflix, A, doesn't care, and B, wants you to watch the stuff that you want to watch so that you keep paying them every month. And it is the rights holders that they are at the behest of that care. And so they kind of secondhand care. But yes, the point still stands.
Secondhand care is still care.
True.
Yeah. There's also some interesting notes he had in here, just other things that came up in his conversation about, one company that, is a holding company that owns like a dozen different VPN brands that they've bought over time. And they found that each VPN kind of has a target market, right? There's one VPN that's focused on gaming and one that's on business and one that's on torrenting or porn or being the cheapest or whatever it is. And they found that, when they tried to take some of the ones they bought years ago and merge them together, the customers got angry when they got, lumped in with users that were meant to do some other thing. And it's like, I don't want my business VPN being the one that is also other people are using for porn and so on.
But meanwhile, it's all using the same service, essentially.
Exactly.
Which is also an indication that if you're providing a commercial VPN, I personally always find it a bit more challenging dealing with clients who are very opinionated without having any knowledge to go along with it. And when you see issues like, oh, well, I need the gaming VPN, not the porn VPN, or I need the business VPN, not the gaming VPN. And in reality, there is no difference but the damn brand. But the providers have learned to maintain the multiple brands that are nothing but a brand because otherwise the clients get angry. Well, that's an indication you're going to be dealing with a lot of irrationality in your client base. And there is an argument to be made, well, maybe you could have a much more focused client base and you could be the DEF CON brand and you only sell to people who know what they're actually doing. But you know what? Those people make terrible customers because they can just spin up their own infrastructure. And largely, they do.
This is all quite sad, though, to me, that in theory, you've got these protocols and open standards that anyone can use, anyone can run a small business with. But the reality is that because of shitheads on the internet, you can't run a small business. You necessarily need to be a medium to large size business to be able to even enter the market.
Humans are always ultimately the problem. That's really what all this boils down to, is the problem with operating these services is you intend to offer them to arbitrary humans, and arbitrary humans cannot be trusted to be wise or kind.
They can't even be trusted to do what's in their own best self-interest.
I think that was covered under wise, but yes, definitely.
Well, either way, it makes me sad. Let's do some feedback. Jonathan, who's a patron, wrote to us. You guys recently had a pretty FreeBSD heavy show. While I've moved to Debian and Ubuntu for most of my self-hosting, and Red Hat in my professional life, I'm still running my trusty TrueNAS core for my home file server. I wanted to keep some form of FreeBSD in my life. With the move towards Linux for TrueNAS, this has left me in a pretty bleak spot to be stuck in. I still want all of my jails. I want my in-kernel ZFS. I feel abandoned. Is no one going to fork the project and keep something close to it going? Not even Alan? Please say it ain't so.
So obviously, you can install FreeBSD and import that pool, and all your stuff will be there, and you can get the jails up and running again. As far as forking the project, the biggest problem there is the giant web GUI stack of out-of-date Python would not be fun to keep working. There's the zVault project where they're, hoping to get enough people together to do that, but there's not been as many signs of life there recently as we thought, or as we would hope there would be.
Yeah, it turns out a web GUI is quite a complex thing.
A hell of a lot more complex than the actual thing that the GUI is trying to administer, yes.
Especially when all of that work is done for you effectively for free by FreeBSD and ZFS and all of that, right?
I would argue even if you had to do everything from scratch, the freaking GUI is a lot more complicated than the actual work that the GUI is trying to administer.
Yeah.
Maybe this is just your kind of push to learn to do it properly, for want of a better word, without the GUI. I know a lot of people love that, ClickOps style, but it's not impossible to do it via the command line with config files and stuff, right?
Not at all. That's how mine works.
Well, I mean, we know it's not. Even Joe is doing it properly from the command line now, right? Am I correct?
Yeah.
I mean, if our half admin can do it, you listeners can do it too. You might not want to, and if you don't, I'm not going to call you names or anything, but in all seriousness, we give Joe a bunch of crap, but he is a pretty good barometer. If Joe can do it and you feel moderately technical, I don't see any reason why you can't as well.
I mean, I did get quite a lot of help from you two, to be fair.
Well, to be fair, we answer an awful lot of listener questions here on the show.
I was going to say, you got the help the same way these people can by writing into the show.
Yeah, just slightly more direct line, shall we say.
Sure. But there are other options as well. I know Jim has followed ZigmaNAS, which is actually a fork of an older version of FreeNAS, back before they switched from PHP to Python for the web GUI. So it is basically TrueNAS with the older web GUI, but based on modern FreeBSD, so that your pool that was in a TrueNAS core, that would be 13.something based, a ZigmaNAS based on FreeBSD 14 would be able to import that and have all the ZFS features and so on would be there. It might be a little work of converting your jails into kind of more plain jails or installing the same jail manager so that you could have all that functionality back. But short of any specific things that were tied to TrueNAS, you would have access to all your files, you'd be able to share them over NFS and SMB and so on, and you'd still have a web GUI. It's not a one-click migration, but it is a reasonable option.
And if you've ever been frustrated with the FreeNAS or TrueNAS, modern interface, if you've ever been annoyed at how hard it is to find things or the random weird, it's giving me the sit and spin icon for 15 seconds for no apparent reason when before it did it immediately. And, I frequently find that TrueNAS makes me feel like I'm standing in quicksand, and ZigmaNAS feels a lot more reliable and predictable. Things don't take any longer than they're supposed to take. The system doesn't, for some reason, require 2 or 3 times as much RAM as you would normally expect it to. Things just work. It's not as shiny as TrueNAS, but if what you really want is just reliability with an easy interface, frankly, I find ZigmaNAS a lot easier to deal with than TrueNAS.
But ZigmaNAS isn't as actively developed by the looks of things. The latest release is from October last year, 2025.
Right, but they only have to do a new release when there's a new major version of FreeBSD. So
I am personally quite fond of the idea of a project that is not in a never-ending dev frenzy where nothing is ever stable, nothing has ever been sufficiently QA'd before it's dumped onto the public. I like a mature, stable product that does a release when it needs to and not before.
And if you're going to subject me to a web GUI, stop moving the buttons every few minutes.
The fact that the releases are on SourceForge kind of puts me off, but maybe I'm just being snobby.
That part I don't really blame you about, but SourceForge is also not as horrible as SourceForge once was. It's still certainly not where I would choose to host a project, but it's not the completely untended or even maliciously tended dumping ground for malware that it was, 15 years ago either.
Fair enough.
Do you want the maintainers of the projects to do another release, or would you like them to spend all their time moving all the hosting to another platform?
Good point.
What other platform has the longevity of SourceForge, where when you put your stuff there, they're not going to send you an email in a couple of weeks saying, oh, we're shutting it down? The number of projects that got burned by Google Code and how many other similar sites where it's like, maybe the one that's been around a long time isn't a bad place to leave my files.
I mean, the closest answer would be GitHub, and I don't think we really need to go into all the reasons people are angry at GitHub right now or the legitimate problems people hosted there are having, myself included.
Yeah, and like for downloading a finished ISO, I don't think GitHub's a very good way to do that either.
Agreed.
Well, speaking of TrueNAS, Lewis, Chris, and others wrote in to say that virtualizing TrueNAS can be a good idea as long as you pass the HBA or SATA controller and therefore all the disks through to the VM.
So it's possible. I'm not sure that it's, the best idea, but if there are reasons that compel you to do that, it is a practical thing. I know a lot of smaller installations of VMware did something like that, where they wanted to have ZFS to back the VMs, but they have the one VMware box. And so they'd make the first VM for it be TrueNAS and pass the HBA through into it and have TrueNAS manage all the ZFS and then export that over iSCSI or NFS back to the host to then host all the other VMs. You can get some kind of bootstrapping problems there where you have really weird dependency ordering, or like the one VM is on the OS drives and the rest of the VMs are on another drive and so on. But yes, it is possible to do that. It's just outside of trying to do some kind of hypervisor machine, I don't know that there's a big reason to do that. And if you're trying to achieve the same thing today, there are hypervisors like Proxmox that run ZFS natively, and actually TrueNAS can run VMs natively. So if you only need to run a couple of VMs and you're not looking to have something all API driven, it may make more sense to just give the raw hardware to your ZFS hosting platform of choice and run the VMs directly from the host that way.
Yeah, this is always a really popular idea, and I would argue that passing the HBA through to directly to your TrueNAS VM, that makes it an acceptable idea. Not a good idea, but an acceptable one. Like if you really want to do that, if you really have a need to do that, sure, that removes the major issue. But in addition to the bootstrapping problems that Alan mentioned, if you're expecting to get the same performance after you introduce this odd extra layer of like iSCSI, even though it's not actually having to go out to your network and back, really, you will still put a very measurable performance impact on the system by inserting that extra layer.
Are we talking throughput or latency?
We're talking both. Now, if you're only needing this over on the actual network, it may not make as much of a difference because the final bottleneck of your actual real network that other machines have to get across to you may make this irrelevant. But if your local performance is important to you, like if you're running databases that need maximal storage performance in order to read huge amounts of data in order to then pass only the query results across the network, yeah, you're very likely to leave a significant amount of performance on the table trying to recreate this siloed approach. I feel like mostly when people do that, it's because they've seen, isolated storage and compute silos in, larger network environments, and they want to do it like the big kids do it. But the way the big kids do it is not necessarily the best way either. And what the big kids are usually doing is they're sacrificing efficiency in favor of making things easier for large teams to manage, because then you can let your storage people have root on the storage side and your compute people have root on the compute side. And that makes it a little bit easier to segregate your maintenance tasks. But in a smaller environment, or even in a large environment where you want maximum performance, I'm not a fan. I like the hyper-converged approach.
Yeah, like most of the places I ever saw this were like ESXi type setups, where it's like, well, ESX doesn't let me run ZFS, so I need to find some way to shoehorn ZFS into this, which is worth doing, right? Having the real snapshots of the VMs and having storage you can trust is worth doing these hoop jumping. But as Jim said, the technology has advanced since then, and we have hypervisors that do natively support ZFS. And one of those is likely to put you in a much better place than trying to deal with, do I have an HBA that's going to be okay with being passed through? And, PCI pass-through is not terrible, but it's an extra layer of virtualization that is, it can just matter if your motherboard supports some of the IOMMU and so on. It's maybe not even possible on some hardware. And it's just an extra layer of complexity or something that can go wrong versus just running ZFS directly on the hypervisor host, whether that's KVM or Beehive or whatever you're going to use.
You get a performance hit just with the PCIe pass-through itself. You're not really expecting to get more than 90, maybe 95% of native performance on something that you pass through via PCIe to a VM, in my experience. And that's not even the big bottleneck. Trying to funnel everything through iSCSI over a virtual network is going to have a considerably larger impact even than the PCIe pass-through is. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's unusably slow or anything, but I am saying like this is a performance difference big enough to actually be concerned about. And this is from the guy that's usually telling everybody, yes, there's a performance difference, but you'll never notice it. Stop worrying about it and make your life easier. This is not making your life easier. This is making your life harder in order to also make things slower. And I'm not a fan. Like Alan said, this mostly makes sense, where you're trying to use something like ESXi that doesn't natively support ZFS. And let's be real here. Nobody should be looking to deploy ESXi at this point. Broadcom has made it clear that if you're moving into the VMware realm now in 2026, you're just a sucker who is desperate to have the hook inserted in your mouth. So don't do that. Whether it's TrueNAS or whether it's ZigmaNAS or whether you want to roll your own with just KVM on the distro of your choice or Beehive under FreeBSD, all of these are things that work just fine with ZFS storage. You don't need to overcomplicate things.
Even paravirtualized networking is still going to use more CPU, so you're wasting a bunch of CPU. And the biggest problem with putting your ZFS in a VM is you're putting a hard cap on how much memory ZFS can have. It means that there will be memory possibly left over on the host that ZFS could be leveraging and isn't, but it also means if you need some of the RAM back, if you have to even just temporarily spin up an extra VM and you would like to sacrifice some of your ZFS cache in order to be able to run that extra VM, it's not that practical to do that when the ZFS is running in a VM that has a fixed amount of RAM defined.
I see storage as kind of like the fundamental foundation of your whole stack almost. Like your compute, your applications in your compute, that is more disposable, can be blown away and redone much more easily than your storage. And so adding that level of jankiness of passing it through to a VM just feels like instinctively the wrong thing to do to me.
Yeah, there's a reason a developer friend of mine says, he likes working on networking because, if you drop a packet, they'll just send it again and probably not even notice. You drop somebody's file system and they're going to hate you for the rest of your life.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Monty has done. I have a shop about 300 feet from my house with woods and a driveway in between. I want to avoid burying a line across the driveway, but would be fine burying a cable in the woods. There's line of sight from my house across the driveway, so I'm hoping I could put an access point there with a solar panel /battery/outdoor enclosure and then run Ethernet cable the rest of the way to another access point at the shop. Is there a better way to solve this problem?
So I've actually encountered this one before, although it was so long ago that it was, when 802.11b was the new hotness. So these guys had a shop for their business on one side of the county road, and their house was on the opposite side. And they got this microwave internet, which was the best thing since dial-up, the only thing better than dial-up in the area. But it was kind of spendy. And so they wanted to be able to have their house on it as well, instead of have to pay for a whole second microwave antenna and so on. And so we did a point-to-point wireless, which is very different than running just access points. We lined them up and pointed them at each other, and it created this two-way link as a virtual Ethernet cable that went across a street that they wouldn't be allowed to dig under, right? Instead of a driveway between, they had an actual, like a county road that was paved, and they couldn't just easily fish a Ethernet cable under or over it. And so we went that route. I don't know about trying to do part of the run with Ethernet cable versus not. And maybe Jim has some insight here. I know he's done some similar things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done a lot of stuff with the TP-Link point-to-point gear. It is very inexpensive. It is very forgiving and easy to set up. When you go shopping for point-to-point wireless gear, it's all littered with all these disclaimers. Like if you're not a professional, don't even think about it. You need perfectly clear line of sight and elevated towers and this and that and the other. And if you want to actually, run like a 2 or 3 mile or up point-to-point link with only 2 pieces, then yes, you probably should be a professional and be willing to elevate towers and make sure you clear tree lines and all that. But if you're just trying to move, 100 or 200 yards, even through like lightly wooded areas, simple point-to-point gear that only costs you, maybe $100 or $200 for the entire thing will do the trick and doesn't really require anything in the way of special equipment. When I tested TP-Link stuff for Ars Technica, I was bridging, if I recall, about 150 yards, lightly to moderately wooded at my parents' house. And I very deliberately just hand-aimed things, had one half of it inside the house running through a living room window, and deliberately aimed them about 10 degrees off axis from one another. And they worked quite fine, very reliably for up to about 100 megabits of throughput. Like actually, the limit was the wired interface on those devices. The Wi-Fi would go faster, but the cheapest devices tend to have old school 100 megabit Ethernet interfaces that you plug the wire into. If you need faster than that, you can get TP-Link also has 802.11ac gear. The cheapest stuff is N300. It only costs you about like $50 per AP. If you're willing to spend about $100 per AP, then you can get 802.11ac gear with gigabit interfaces, and you can run up to like 800 or 900 megabits across one of these links. It's not difficult to set up. The biggest thing that I have to warn you is don't just try to make it part of your existing omnidirectional Wi-Fi. You don't want to do that. It's possible to do that, but you will screw up your performance terribly if you do. You want to set those things up on their own private Wi-Fi link. Don't let anybody else join that Wi-Fi, and you literally just use it as a bridge between locations. If you need omnidirectional Wi-Fi in the remote location that you're bridging from your house to, your barn or your shed or whatever, then just throw an extra AP on the other side of that bridge and treat it just like you would treat an extra AP in the house itself. And again, everything will work just fine. As far as the AP is concerned, it's just on the other end of a wire.
Do you need to consider the transmission power? Because I know we talk about that with access points generally, but with this point-to-point link, is that something you need to tweak?
You absolutely should consider it. The point-to-point APs are actually a lot better about walking you through that process and making recommendations. When you're talking about, a simple project like this, you're only talking about a couple hundred yards. You've got a relatively clear-ish line of sight, like you can at least see the other building from the first one. It's going to recommend the absolute lowest power, and you should accept that recommendation, because what you don't want to do is potentially screw up other people's Wi-Fi with your nonsense for like 5 miles on the other end of your shed or what have you. And we will provide a link to my Ars Technica walkthrough from several years ago on using the cheaper TP-Link units, bridging in between my parents' house and their barn, so that you can take a look at that and see what the process looks like.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at alanjude.com.
We'll see you next week.